The next report before I engage you more substantively. We have Benson Ochieng in studio. He is not only an environmental lawyer, he is ED, and that is Executive Director, Institute for, let me just check my notes here, make sure I get it right, and that is the Institute for Law and Environmental Governance. Karibu sana.
Thank you.
Good to have you in studio. I'm going to pose the same question I posed to Zainab Wandate there. I'm going to put you on the spot. Did the Nairobi Declaration meet your expectations?
No, it didn't. I saw a lot of platitudes in the final communique or the declaration. We are yet to see the substance or what that will culminate into in practice on the ground. Well, it is good that it's a platform to build momentum for global engagement, and particularly in the run-up to the next conference of parties in UAE. It is also good to understand that there was substantial commitment in terms of monies. We have been told 23 billion. That is no small sum by any means. That would be good. But in terms of the demands that we have seen so forcefully communicated, and in terms of expectations, I think probably we are expecting too much. This thing has been going around for over 3 decades, and nothing much has come out of it. The promises have not been fulfilled. So I think it would have been best to understand how African governments are going to invest their own monies and source their own monies, rather than look outside to expect that people will bring money to Africa simply because of the meeting.
Okay, but the president did say at the Africa Youth Summit that he's aiming for 100. If you attain even 10%, it's better than aiming for 10% and getting 100% of that. But we'll continue this conversation. But first, let's take a look at a report on said expectations of the summit. And the world now waits to see whether African countries are determined to wield more global influence and bring in far more financing and support for climate action in line with the commitments in the Nairobi Declaration. Several stakeholders have criticized the summit, saying it did not meet expectations because they overpromised but seriously under-delivered. This, according to the critics, means that Africa will be going to COP28. I wonder, in a weakened position?
After 3 days of intense discussions by more than 20 heads of state and government representatives, it is now evident that the first African Climate Summit has taken a leap of faith and is now seeking to assert a stronger voice on global climate challenges, which it contributes the list to.
At the summit, our shared understanding became clear that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, it is indeed the future, and that we are the last frontier of untapped potential.
But as the heads of state celebrated a successful outcome of the summit, criticism has started pouring in, many feeling that what the summit set out to do is not what was delivered.
There is also no strong call for historical polluters to be able to take responsibility and allocate resources in loss and damage fund, and also there's no strong commitment for adaptation.
Our northern counterparts have promised and they've not fulfilled their promises. And the other challenge also that we see, and this came out also in the summit, is that we are getting announcements, piecemeal announcements and commitments in terms of money. Like, for instance, we had an announcement from the US about them supporting particular adaptation initiatives. We are saying that these announcements, we do not want distractions. The commitment still stands, and we want to make sure that we continue the discussions in the multilateral way.
On his part, President William Ruto says the declaration will help put systems in place for the African region and drive the African agenda.
We also made it clear that we are aware of the unjust configuration of multilateral institutional frameworks that perpetually place African nations on the back foot through costly financing, which plunge our economies into debt trap and deny them resources needed to mitigate and adapt in response to climate change, invest in energy transition, and facilitate industrialization to create jobs and wealth.
Some of the experts questioned the involvement of the global North climate leaders in what was purely an African summit, prompting claims of hijacking the summit by some of the Western top polluters, allegations that Kenya, as the host, vehemently denied.
African leaders are hopeful that the signing of the Nairobi Declaration is a step in the right direction to see the continent rise as it targets to increase Africa's renewable clean energy at a more cost-effective capacity while creating green opportunities for the youth. On the other hand, some believe more still needs to be done to ensure the global north takes responsibility. Helen Aura, NTV.
All right, just a reminder that we have Benson Ochieng in studio. He is an environment lawyer and also ED Executive Director, Institute for Law and Environmental Governance. On the other side of Helen Aura's story, I had asked you whether this declaration, the Nairobi Declaration, met your expectations. My question to you now is, has it resonated with the global community? Imesikika na kishindo?
It's hard to say. I mean, the declaration was made today in the evening. We don't know how the world is going to react to it, but I believe for a majority of the northern counterparts in this business, particularly in the north, I don't think it has shaken them much, because at least we can see it is the same old story of expecting that resources are going to flow from those who have it to those who don't. How do you enforce that mechanism that has failed to take off over the last 3 decades? The issues of climate finance and carbon trading did not start yesterday. Remember, by 1997, we were talking of the Kyoto Protocol, where we invented the flexibility mechanisms, joint implementation, emission trading, clean development mechanism. They didn't deliver. Over the years that we have moved from Kyoto to COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen, we were talking about Green Climate Fund, where the global community committed to mobilize 100 billion USD by year 2020. That has not been achieved. And the same mechanisms that we have been hoping to or trying to rely on to solve the problem of climate change have never delivered to date. I think that is why I would emphasize when we go for these summits and when we organize them, we should look more inwardly. Where do we raise the resources to do this internally within the various African countries? How can we mobilize internal resources or make commitments to make this part and parcel of our global, continental development and national development commitments? I think it is time to look more inward than look outside and expect that money is going to flow from those countries to Africa.
My understanding is, this is how this was framed, is that this summit would be a game changer. And I remember in his opening remarks, the president said the world has been meeting at these events for the last 31 years. But because Africa, this is the first time Africa is meeting. And he was of the view that we are shifting the conversation from from victim to what we are due, not what we are owed, but what we are due. Because he said we need to factor into our GDPs, our asset base, the carbon lungs, for instance, of Africa. Is it your considered opinion that the conversation has shifted in that direction?
The fact of the matter is that the power dynamics in global negotiations and engagement doesn't favor Africa. And it is one thing to want to say we want to change the conversation and we don't want to be victims or to talk like victims anymore. It is another thing to get these people to the negotiating table and then get them to commit that we are going to give you this money, get the right channels and mechanisms that can force them to do it, because they're not going to do it cheap. The reality of geopolitics is that people want to take advantage and to maintain positions of dominance. That is why we have the G20, we have the G whatever, and there are always levels of engagement where some do not even want to invite the others to the negotiating table or to engage them. So that's the reality or real politic at global level. I think for African governments, the question of how do we mobilize these resources and how do we organize our own development to the extent that we can deal with the issues first, to address the issues of adaptation, to address economic development needs of the people. And it would be fair then to take stock of what each African country is doing I know in Kenya there has been a lot of activity and a lot of concern for what we can do as a country. And within National Treasury, which is the focal point for climate finance, there are initiatives, a very innovative one for that matter, financing locally led climate action, otherwise called FLOCA, which has worked with county governments to see to it that development planning for climate change and adaptation is done at the ward level, and then it is upscaled to the county level, and then it builds into the national level. One would want to see such kind of initiatives replicated across the continent, and less of expectation that the help is going to come from the north. So whether we cast the debate as not being victims, but being part of the solution or not, I think is not the real issue. The real issue is how do we organize our own development and how do we mobilize our own resources and make sure that we channel it as part and parcel of our development planning and concern. That way, I think we stand a better chance than to expect that the global financial architecture is going to change, that we are going to get these resources from whoever, that we are going to make them guilty or feel that they owe a responsibility to us. I think that is outside the realities of global geopolitics, and I don't see it coming anytime soon.
All right. So we'll have to end it there, but I have a show called AM Live. We have much more time then. I will invite you for part 2 of this discussion, especially on the question of debt and also the carbon markets. But we take a break. On the other side. ODM National